Father's Day is rapidly approaching, and if your dad already has a garage full of tools and insists no more ties, then I suggest you try this episode's sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Home Field is a premium brand based in Indianapolis, creating incredibly comfortable, officially licensed collegiate wear from over 150 colleges. They dive deep into each school's history, finding unique logos and mascots to craft nostalgic designs. So for a Father's Day gift to knock out the competition, why don't you take your dad down memory lane of his college glory years when he was big man on campus? You can do this by making sure you head to homefieldapparel.com. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com. In 1843, Alexander Bain invented the electric printing telegraph. According to HP's website, this development simulated a 2D image on paper, taking the limited communication potential of a telegraph to a whole new level. This ultimately led to the technology that Xerox used in 1964 to invent the fax machine as recognized by modern people. Well, not really so much modern people anymore, but speaking of fax machines, this week's guest used this now dinosaur of a technology to play fantasy football.
Welcome to Fantasy Football Origin Stories, where each episode is a journey back in time to explore the unique experiences of some of the coolest and most influential people in the fantasy football industry. I'm your host, Arnie Chapman, also known as the Football History Dude. Now, I love fantasy football, and I want you to come along with me to explore the yesteryear of the armchair gridiron. So hop on board my DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time we start off the DeLorean. The date is December 19th, 1965, and we are in St. Louis, Missouri to watch a game between the Cleveland Browns and the St. Louis Cardinals. Yes, before they moved to Arizona, the Cardinals were in St. Louis, baby. But even before that, they had moved from Chicago. They were actually an original team and the oldest professional football team in the NFL as the Chicago Cardinals. But that's not the type of history lesson we got to give to you this week. It's about that Cleveland game we talked about, because this closed out the season for the Cleveland Browns and the most famous Brown of them all, Jim Brown, ending the year with 1,872 scrimmage yards for 21 touchdowns. A great year now, but back then that was even better because that was in only 14 games for 313 non-PPR points. Because this week's guest, who was born in 1965, they didn't know anything about non-PPR. Actually, they would have only counted touchdowns. So hey, actually this might be a little bit closer of a gap, because the second place, who was the runner-up, actually the rookie of the year, Gale Sayers, had 1,374 yards for 20 touchdowns. So, depending on what league scoring format you're looking at, that was only one touchdown difference, right? But it was actually a massive gap if you count in the yards and everything, not counting PPR, 257 non-PPR points. So we're talking a difference of, let me pull my calculator out here because I'm not going to do that math. Let's go with 313. Whoa. Put the backspace button on this bad boy. We got 313 minus 257 equals 56. Whoa! That's yours truly's football number. So Mr. 56 in 65. Again, pretty wide gap where Jim Brown wins the AP MVP award and Gale Sayers win that Rookie of the Year award. But back to that December 19th game. Because although he didn't know it at the time, that would be the last regular season game of Jim Brown's career. The 29-year-old went out swinging. Well, I mean, literally, he went out swinging, because in the second quarter of this game, he actually got into a fight and was ejected from the game. So stats would have even been higher. But think about that. His last game, he gets ejected, and then ends up retiring, some Hollywood movie and all that type of stuff, decides to announce it. But he ended his career with 8 NFL rushing titles out of 9. That's just insane. 8 times out of 9 attempts, he was the top leading rusher in the NFL. I mean, dynasty player of the century. And of course, before you at me, I got to tell you, yes, I do realize that there were some years, depending on what list you look at, that he was actually not the number one. There were some other names in there. But if you look even further, the reason why is because those teams were in the AFL at the time, not the NFL. So from the NFL perspective, yes, 8 out of 9 seasons, Jim Brown was a leading rusher. But why do we even care about this whole landscape in 1965? Why this year? Well, that's where this week's guest comes in, because he's going to talk about roaming with the dinosaurs back in 1965 when he was just a wee little baby. And as he spent a ton of time in fantasy football over the past 3 decades, this week's guest, Jim Coventry, longtime fantasy analyst working with RotoWire. You may see him Sunday mornings on YouTube or catch him on SiriusXM or many other platforms out there. And I'm honored to welcome Jim Coventry to share his fantasy football origin story with us today. But first, now's a great time for me to remind you that if you like the show, come on, man, you gotta share it with at least one friend. And if you do, you gotta make sure that they mash that little subscribe button or follow button, depending on what app you're using, on their podcast player of choice. That way they get the hottest, freshest out the press episodes, well, each and every week. But without further ado, let's get into that interview with Mr. Jim Coventry. Yeah, I know. It's like you're in a different perspective than, say, somebody that just does it on the side or whatever kind of thing, which is pretty cool. We'll get into that a little bit here. But the first thing that we're going to do is, I guess, I don't know if you can see this. You got the DeLorean right here. So you're
nice.
Yeah, man. That's part of the premise of the show. You're going to go back in time. I mean, we'll dig into maybe some of the first memories of fantasy football back, but let's go to 96 when I saw in your bio that you were a national contest winner. First off, what was it like as fantasy football back in 96, and what kind of a contest did you win?
Oh my gosh. So this was funny. The contest itself was one of these where there were categories of players. I believe 16 categories. In each category, there were 4 players. So you would pick a player from each category. Throughout the course of the season, you were allowed some ridiculously small number of roster changes. It may have been in the area of like 6 or 7. And those had to be done on a phone line. You had to call them in. It was insane. And it was done through, so there used to be the Football Digest magazine, the Baseball Digest magazine. So this contest they ran, it was $15 entry with no fee for changes of players. And the winner got $5,000. And I almost led wire to wire. And I was down in second place for a week or 2, and then I was able to come back. And the way you found out your place, you had to call, again, a pre-recorded line, and they would go over the standings. But it was fun. And the only mistake I made, and this is one that I typically don't make, I made one player selection with my heart and not my head. And in the category where Brett Favre was at, Jerry Rice was at. And I love Jerry Rice, and I took Jerry Rice. Favre outscored him pretty easily that year, and I knew all along I should have taken Favre. But I just, for whatever reason, and I won't make that mistake. I mean, I haven't made it since. I don't let my heart rule my picks, and I'm glad that one didn't cost me.
I mean, the typical, like we always talk about the homer picks and everything. I mean, we've all made them as a Lions fan. I've had a lot of years where I picked some Lions players that it probably didn't work out too well. I mean, you said, okay, I took Rice instead of Favre. So this is a totally different. It's nothing like nowadays. You pick your quarterback, you run it. It was like was it just randomized, or how did they break down the tiers?
No. It was like basically the top point scorers, either from the prior year, or if the managers of the site added a player in or realized one didn't belong. But they were all tiers of similarly scoring players that were expected to be in the same tier. So the alpha tier was mostly quarterbacks, but Jerry Rice, he always had his own category, right? Couldn't put him with the receivers, but he was scoring with the quarterbacks. So yes, it was, and most of the time though, it was mostly running back in the same category. And it may have only been that number 1 category that had a non-similar position player in it.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, we're talking a totally different world and everything. Did you said you called in. Was this, you called in and you had, like, I don't know, a nickname like we have fantasy team names now, or was it literally Jim Coventry?
No, it was like literally Jim Coventry. There was like so no frills. I mean, it was the basic of the basic. Not as basic as when I started playing fantasy football and everything was done out of box scores and newspapers by hand. I would fax a league report for my home league to all, at the time it was a 10-team league. We were just starting. And so, yeah, I would write a report up on the teams and I would fax that to everybody.
Okay, so I mean, we're going way back, and we're breaking some kids that are watching and listening to this, their brains right now, like, what is a fax machine and everything? But you said not when I first started. Oh, take me back to that first, I don't know, season, if you can even remember which season it was, but like, what was the first season you started playing fantasy football?
I started in 94, and it was a matter of finding enough people who were going to be interested, because fantasy rotisserie baseball had been a bit of a thing, but there weren't enough people that you would know who might be imaginative enough to want to play in fantasy football. But I was diligent and asked through friend circles, and we were able again to cobble together 10 people, and a core of 5 or 6 stuck together for, I would say, about 25 years. That league didn't break up that long ago, but the core stayed together for a while. But basically that was it. And it was obviously the old school drafting. You show up in someone's backyard or at an establishment and you had your draft, you had the smack talk, you had the fun. And I still have some drafts like that. The King's Classic in Canton, Ohio, with other industry analysts. Belts over my shoulder, but all people can't see it because we're on a podcast. But anyway, yes. So those drafts where you met with people, you had camaraderie, you had a blast that way. Those are irreplaceable.
Oh, I'm the one that releases tomorrow is with the founder of FanDraft, and that we talk about that. There's no replacement for being in person. We'll get to the Kings Classic later, which is now easy to find somebody to talk to for fantasy football. What back then? First, what got you thinking, I'm gonna try this fantasy football thing, and then second, you said you had to go find guys. Like, was it one of those things where it was like not known at all, right?
Right. Fantasy football was not known. It was never talked about in any circle that I was running in. And, I imagine there weren't many fantasy football leagues anywhere at that point in time. Now, I always loved the idea of managing my own team. And the start that I got, a lot of people know the name of an old school game called Stratomatic Baseball, and there was Stratomatic Football. I played a game that was very similar. It was called APBA. APBA was pronounced APBA. So it was the same thing, like similar to Stratomatic. And I did have friends, and baseball was the key one. Football was a little bit more difficult to navigate, but those were games where you managed your own team, you set your own lineup, there were results of games, and you really felt like you were running a team. And so whenever something would have become available to live in that realm, that was what I was going to get into. And then again, I don't even remember how I figured out this concept of fantasy football is possible. I had to have heard it somewhere. I can't remember if there was something. I had to have. I don't remember, though.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where you don't remember the specific moment. Even on this show, when I ask people these questions, I go back and I'm like, I think I have like 2 or 3 different stories of my first remembrance of fantasy football. But like, how did you even, nowadays, the 5th string running back that's on the practice squad. But back then, it's not like you could watch every game, no NFL ticket. Like, no. How did you even manage who am I going to put on my roster?
This was difficult. Now, there were publications like, oh my gosh, it was a newspaper. It was Pro Football Weekly. Pro Football Weekly at the time, Hub Arkush, they were pioneers. They gave you a lot of information about teams. And it was very, very useful in kind of getting a leg up on people because there was no Sunday ticket. Basically, you'd watch highlights on ESPN or wherever, but you didn't have access to watching every game. So you were watching box scores, of course, but that only tells a small sliver of the story. They didn't even track targets back then. So a guy could have had 7 targets, caught 2 for 14 yards, but may have been an integral part of the offense. So yes, it was very difficult. But I remember that was a great resource, and that actually, reading that, helped put me ahead of people. Early on, John Hansen was doing a piece for ESPN. That was, and I don't remember the name of it. He did that article like through his time at Fantasy Guru and probably Fantasy Points now. I don't remember the name of it, but he was always like highlighting players that were on the rise. So you found some resources because you didn't have the opportunity to see things for yourself, so you had to work with others. Injury reports. I remember Steve Cohen did the football injuries report, and you'd subscribe to it, and you would get, again, people don't know what a fax is. Through your phone, there was a printer, and you would get this printout of these detailed injury reports that nobody was getting besides saying probable, questionable, and out. You were getting dirt on players that you would know, oh, wow, so he has a really good chance of playing, even though it sounds like he's not going to. Any little edge I could get, I would get. So there wasn't much information, but you got what you could.
Yeah, Cotter, for some reason, no, this is not fantasy football, but when you started talking about that, it reminded me back in 36 when they had the first draft and Burt Bell and all those guys, like they would take in the room, I don't know if you heard this story, but it was basically the previous year's magazine of all the college players, and they would just start picking them based on that. And then, of course, our buddy Gil Brandt, when he comes in with the 60s and the Cowboys, and they like revolutionized, how are we going to do a draft? And so it's almost like just getting that information ahead of the next person, like really can set you ahead. It's just a correlation there for sure. Speaking of the Cowboys, so 94, I mean, you came in like right, I don't know if it was that year they won or if they were winning all of them around that time. So Emmitt Smith and all that type of stuff. Like, what was throughout the history of your draft? I mean, you've had so many different fantasy leagues. Like if you could pick one player, like, man, that was my favorite player to have on my team, regardless of year.
So it's always going to be Jerry Rice. I remember there was a game, and I might be a little off on the points here. I'm going to be close though. There was a Monday night game against the Dolphins. I was down about 50. Jerry Rice got me there. Literally got me there. He had his Jerry Rice game. He didn't have him every week, of course, but he had that Jerry Rice game. And then some gracious owner, I'll call him, later traded me Steve Young. So there was a year I had Steve Young and Jerry Rice, maybe a couple of years, because we were able to keep players in that league. That had a long story on that league, but having that duo was insane before stacking was a real thing. But man, because Steve Young was running for a bunch of yards and Jerry Rice was tearing it up. But Jerry Rice, he was the one. He was the player, and I was able to. So how did I acquire Jerry Rice? It was actually a trade, and Jerry Rice had gone through a little slump. And again, this was like the age of no information. I had Sterling Sharp on a team. Shannon Sharp's older brother, who was becoming a legend playing with Brett Favre until he messed up his neck. But I want to say I traded straight up because the person loved Sterling Sharp. And it was, again, not enough information. So I straight up Sterling Sharp for Jerry Rice. I guess I won that trade. Lost a few cents, but that was a win.
Yeah, I mean, maybe even a short term, like you said, but long term, especially if you can keep the player. I mean, was that so the whole, you said keep a player, was keepers like a thing for a while or no?
So I always have liked to do my own thing. And within 2 years of that initial league we had, I decided we were going to do what we call a contract league. As soon as you acquired a player, you immediately assign him to a 1 through an 8 year contract. If you sign him to a long contract, you're going to be stuck with players. So you had to be careful. Anytime a player was in the last year of his deal, he was always free to cut. But we did it was similar to a franchise tag. We called it an exemption. An exemption was each year you could modify or terminate any one contract on your roster. And so that gave you a little flexibility. But again, if you didn't manage contracts well, you were often saddled with bad contracts, especially rookies. People would like to sign rookies to 6-7 year deals. And if they were Maurice Clarett out of Ohio State, who never really played much, that was a bad contract. And plenty of us had those. So that was the league I came up with. And it was one of these things where once we felt we trusted the owners, it was that trades would never be undone unless the owner left the league at the end of the season and we realized that trade was his way out the door and it was a trade that was imbalanced, and at that point we could undo it. Otherwise, we always made it, your trade stands.
Mm-hmm. Well, so how did you manage all of this? This is this is before we had the actual like apps and stuff.
Yes. I mean, like I said, everything was pencil and paper. Early stages of computers were coming in, but but not really much. Everything was pencil and paper. And then obviously pretty quickly after, when we got closer to 98 and 2000, we were able to use enough computers. Email, obviously, email was something we could send things through. And that was probably in 96, 97. So it didn't take long to use email. And, and look, they had to trust me. They had to trust me as the commissioner that I would just do my thing and keep up the contracts, note them, mark them. At the end of the season, I send everybody an update. We drop the contracts a year. So that would go out that way. But that was the way we had to do it.
But, talk about, because you've seen through that lens, communication methods just transfer through time. Just like the whole "you've got mail" meant something different when you got a trade offer on the other line, I guess.
Oh my gosh, you're not lying about that. Yeah, the instantaneous nature of everything now, it can be overwhelming. It's a fantastic thing so you don't miss anything. But the thing is, sometimes if you're in a lot of leagues and there's a lot going on, man, it is tough to keep up. But I think the people who are playing in 1, 2, and 3 leagues, I think that's a sweet spot for a lot of people, like casual players, because it's enough to keep you busy. It's enough to give you a great hobby, a great experience, but it might not overwhelm your life unless you allow it to. But it's a great thing for everybody. Like, sickos like me that do it for a living. Well, I have to cap myself besides the best ball leagues. I try to cap at 10 leagues. I really don't like to play more than 10 managed leagues.
Speaking of that, now you do it for a living, which of course you didn't grow up saying, I'm going to be a fantasy football analyst, and nobody really did at that age. Go back to the beginning of the time when you said, I think I might try to do something as far as like being an analyst, maybe not even called an analyst at that time, but go back to the beginning and then up through now you talking on the Fantasy Football Origin Story show.
As a unknowing young person, when I was born when dinosaurs roamed the earth back in 1965. So fortunately, a dinosaur didn't take me out. But I always, in my crude world, said, man, it would be great to be like a national presence in terms of an announcer or something like that. But I wasn't going to school for that. And it was something in your mind, because I was never that home fan. I was always the person that wanted to know about all the teams as much as I could. Whatever I could learn, I wanted to be a fan of the game. And so I always would have loved to be an opportunity where I could be somebody that had worked with all of the teams in terms of, getting information out or sharing information. And I don't think I ever would, I definitely would never have gotten into the industry. But the woman who's now my wife, we were dating, and she realized early on, oh my gosh, you watch football all day on Sunday every week? Well, that's not going to work. DirecTV costs a ton. We can't afford that. So you've got to make some money doing that. So this is back in 07, 2006, 2007. And so she said, well, here's what we're going to do. Again, the internet was still around, but it was not a big thing. It really wasn't that early. So we went to the local Barnes & Noble, and I went to the back of each fantasy magazine to see if there was contact information. Usually you get a company's contact information in the back page. And so I started writing down different information about different places. And I said, all right, well, here's going to be my calling card. I was an English teacher, so I could write. I had won that national challenge. So to me, at least it showed I knew a little something about football. So it was kind of those two things I was going to say, can I do something? So I sent out a couple of things at first. I was going to wait and see what happened. So I sent an email to John Hansen at Fantasy Guru. And basically, I didn't want to be too pushy. So I just said, you know what? I just want to write. So is it possible I could do my own internship thing, just write for you for a year and then go from there? And John was cool with that. He said, yeah, let's do it. I gave him a sample of writing. He saw that and it kind of told him, little my low credentials, but John gave me that chance. And so at the end of the season, I was very hopeful that I could work for John. Well, what happened was at the end of the season, there was news that Adam Kaplan and John were merging. Adam was with football injuries, and obviously John was with Fantasy Guru. And when I saw that they were merging, I'm like, oh, they're going to have two companies. They're not going to need anybody. And so I had sent John an email asking if I could work for him, and John didn't get back to me. And a few months passed. And at this point now, it's probably April. And so before I get to what happened in April, at that point, well, John ends up contacting me now to explain how I got another job, John contacted me later. He's like, man, I'm terrible with email. I saw this. I would have wanted to gotten back to you. And so that was unfortunate. I would have liked to have worked with John, but here's what ended up happening. Similar to what I did with the Barnes & Noble, I went online this time because there was a little more availability, and I was looking up companies, fantasy sites, and obviously there was no postings for jobs listed, so I cold called 11 different companies. 7 got back to me within 48 hours. Some were, work for free. Some were this pay, that pay. Lenny Papano from Draft Sharks, what a blessing. Lenny brought me in, gave me a prominent role as a senior writer, and paid me very well. And it was great working for Lenny and Jared Smola. I think Matt Schaff might have been starting a little bit around, and he was in the time when I was there, but really it was at the time, it was Jared Smola and it was Lenny Papano. And those guys gave me a phenomenal opportunity. They let me do pretty much everything but the rankings. Because Jared does a great job with the rankings. Jared was doing the rankings then. So I get my hand in anything else, research, articles, and they just let me go. And so that was wonderful. And I worked with them pretty much until 2016. And that was great. And then at that point, whatever happened, we just began to part ways. I really don't remember what happened there. It was amicable. I mean, I love those guys. They're outstanding people, and still communicate with Jared Smola a bit. Lenny, I know, is so awesome and busy. Don't talk to Lenny much, but that's not because of anything personal. It's just because, Jared's like in the space. He's out there pumping out content where Lenny is, he's like the CEO. So yeah, but if I see Lenny, I'd love to talk to him. But anyway, so at that point then, off to looking for another job, and RotoWire came in, and it was great with RotoWire. So yeah, RotoWire has been a phenomenal blessing. And the best thing that happened from RotoWire, aside from meeting the wonderful people who have really, and this is just not saying, they treat me like family. They treat everybody like family. Just a wonderful company, great people across the board. But it was them that gave me the opportunity to go on SiriusXM. And I didn't have a dream of doing this, obviously, because when I was around as a kid, this wasn't a thing. But man, if you had asked me what a dream was, I don't know. I think I would take SiriusXM over TV. I think I would.
I mean, it's pretty cool that you're able to, like you said, knew you wanted to get into something national, cover everything, and then fantasy football became a passion, and you're able to meld the two together. I mean, even as far as like we'll get into some of the other things, but like your YouTube type, where your Q&As, I mean, able to interact with the people. First, let's tell them if they ever want, when the season comes up, how to get there, and then B, like, what can they expect from your Q&As?
Yeah, the hub for everything for me is pretty much Twitter. At Jim Coventry NFL, you'll always know what's going on with me there. Whether I put up a TikTok, it gets put on Twitter. And I don't dance. Everybody, you're safe. You are totally safe. No dancing, just football content. Instagram, it all goes that way. My SiriusXM shows, I will put those and post those up on Twitter. That's the hub. So again, at Jim Coventry NFL. Anything I'm doing with RotoWire. Now, subscribers, it's great, but I won't tweet content behind the paywall because it's kind of pointless. Because then people are like, oh, you're trying to, push. And that's not my point. So, but the Q&As. So the Q&As, my favorite ones, I think this is what you're referring to, the in-season ones on Sunday. Man, I love those. They're so much fun. We've gotten a pretty good following of people, and it really makes me happy because people have so many great choices out there. And I just started doing the stream for RotoWire maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, this Sunday question and answer. And people could have already established where they're going and been great with it. And honestly, there's like a couple hundred people that come in like every week, regulars. And it's an honor to serve them, that they trust me with their fantasy questions. But here's my deal. And Arnie, you probably know this. My whole thing is I give a darn about the what. The why is all that matters. If you ask me who to start and I say, start Lamar Jackson, don't listen to me. Listen to me if I give you a why. And I don't even want you to, if I give you the why, here's my whole point. I want to give you everything I know. I will give you the upside, the downside, the injuries that are related to the injury. To the player, I should say. Maybe there's an offensive lineman hurt. I'll tell you about that. There could be key defensive players at certain positions out. I will give you everything I know in a quick format so that you're armed to make your best decision. In that quick answer, I will give you potential for upside and downside. But I really try to frame that. So I want to give you the why. That's my whole fantasy thing, is that I know each analyst does something really well, but I have a really good understanding of how the defenses work, which players impact what specific functions. Offensive linemen, I have a good working knowledge of when this lineman's out, what'll happen. And so I think that knowledge, that everybody has to have something that separates them from the pack. And I know there's others that do it, but that basically separates me from a lot of the pack.
Yeah, you kind of led into one of the questions I like to ask of, like, what's your fantasy superpower? For you, I guess we'll say on your tombstone you put, he gave you the why. But okay, let's dig it a little further deep behind that scenes then of your fantasy superpower of being able to digest that information. What, other than I've been around since the dinosaurs roamed the earth, what led you think, to be able to pick apart that type of stuff for the listener?
I think we underrate our brains. The human brain is like capable of anything, but you've got to turn it loose. And they talk about this idea of the synapses in the brain, how when you're learning about something you're interested in, if you keep just immersing it with knowledge, the knowledge like grabs onto the other knowledge and it builds. And I believe that my bank of knowledge, and I've been following football since I was like 10 years old. Now, obviously, we had limited ways to follow it. But I really believe that bank of knowledge, the thousands of games I've watched, and it all banks up knowledge. And I believe that the knowledge continues to grow, and I keep adding on. And I never stop looking to gain knowledge, anything I can learn. And I believe that just the way it worked for me, that my brain just compiles this together. And I'm good at being able to identify why it matters for this team or that team, differences. It's just being fully immersed in the NFL 12 months a year. I believe in specialization. Look, there are great people that can do baseball and football. I personally believe if you want to be the best possible resource for others, you specialize in one sport. And RotoWire has been beautiful to allow me to do that. They don't make me do the other sports. So I am all year. I'm just locked into NFL. So you can imagine that when somebody asks me a question, I haven't taken a month off. I haven't taken the off season off. I've been grinding literally all year long for you to give you the best possible content I am capable of giving you.
Yeah, it makes sense. It reminded me of, and I'm going to totally butcher how it works, but something that Elon Musk, when he learns a particular thing, like something about like a tree for the base, and then he'll add the branches on. But yeah, that kind of reminded me of that right there. And you're always immersed, so you're niche and breaking it down. What? Let's go to this one next. So you kind of broke that in. For some reason, I saw in your RotoWire where, like in 2012, I decided I'm going to go into DFS. Like, what was the whole? Is it because that's when DraftKings came out, or?
So if you think about it, if you're doing these national contests, and most of the time you're not cashing the $250K, and if you can't afford to play in 50 or 80 or 100 leagues, you're definitely not winning that, right? And think about the bang for the buck in those leagues. It's horrible. If all the time you're going to funnel in, again, if you could afford 200, 300 leagues, different ball game. But if you're just playing 3 to 5 leagues, you're not winning. You're not winning those jackpots. You might win a good haul, but it's not going to be enough to justify your whole season, right? So now DFS, here's an opportunity each week to win something. Now, we're moving to gambling. And actually, I should update my profile because now I'm more on the gambling side. I love fantasy and I play fantasy, and it's a super important part of what I do. But I'm trying to gain an edge with player props because my job is player evaluation. So now I'm going to be morphing. Last year, very little DFS. I moved it to gambling because, again, bang for the buck, time and opportunity. And so I'm just trying to find the best place to allocate my time and resources. If I'm going to play for money, I want it to be the best potential play for money. My fantasy leagues, I don't play those for money. They're charity leagues. They're industry leagues. None of those are for profit. Those are all for, the greater good of the fantasy community.
I was going to ask you this question, but maybe you kind of answered it earlier about the whole, well, I want to know about what the difference of DFS was back then, but I was going to, sounds like through time, because you're so immersed, maybe that's the recommendation to a person that when you're going to get into a new thing, when I shifted from regular fantasy to DFS, it's like to always be immersed. I mean, do you think that helped you get along when you started with DFS?
Yeah. Oh, the immersion is so helpful because instead of knowing the top, 35 receivers, I have no issue diving down into the 3,000 range, the 4,000 range, and understanding in certain matchups, this player can do this, this, and that. This defense might struggle in the slot. They might struggle in the deep slot. And so knowing by immersion all the nuances of all the different players and seeing where you might be able to get an edge on the field. Does it always work? Of course not. Superstars, they tank, how many games a season, right? So, but again, it's all about just creating an edge. You just want to get a slight potential edge on the market, and you hope that over time, those slight edges end up paying off. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I was actually trying to figure out how I was going to, this was now switching to baseball. I was trying to figure out how to lob up a softball for you to answer it. And now here's my opportunity. Okay, I'm a person that doesn't have time to immerse myself, but now where can I go to try to get this information?
You outsource. And outsourcing is a great, great use of your time and resources. You, as a fantasy player, decide who you trust, what opinions you want to hear. Now, sometimes we make the mistake of wanting to gravitate to people who think like us. And that's just confirmation bias. So I think the best fantasy players find people, some who kind of agree with their mindset, some who they respect the process, but are very different. Limit the streams you have coming in, but make sure there's sources that you completely trust. There is a fantasy analyst out there for everybody. There are people that do great things on just YouTube and Twitter. There are people that do things for companies. There are free options. There are paid options. There are some that are great in both areas. But the first work is choosing on your own. Don't always just take somebody's recommendation. Oh, this fantasy analyst is good. All right, fine. But before you decide on an inner circle, make sure the inner circle is a balance for you that gets you the information the way you want to process it. Because ultimately, what fun is it if other people are making your decisions? You want people to influence your thought process. Like you said, you're too busy. Everybody's too busy. So by taking a inner circle, you have time for the inner circle. Now when you have to make your decision, your time has been exponentially chopped.
There you go. And speaking of some of the people that are in the industry, let's talk about that King's Classic and that championship belt you got back there. I mean, what is a King's Classic for someone that hasn't heard about it? And just share a quick little story, maybe.
Man, the King's Classic, what a blessing. RotoWire sends me to represent them at the King's Classic. This started in 2018. Basically, so between Bob Lung, who is the front man for it, but also Brad Evans was also, and Mike Clay to a degree. It really was the three of them, but Bob does the grunt work, and that's understating. Bob is the ringmaster. He is like the ultimate ringmaster. That's what I should say. Bob is the man, but he sets this massive weekend. We'll get to that in a second. But again, I don't want to short Brad Evans and Mike Clay because they've been an integral part in the setup process. So in 2018, the idea was we get some of the best fantasy companies and analysts in the business. We come out to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We draft at the Hall of Fame. Then we hang out for a couple of days, but we make that the pinnacle event of fantasy football. And like I said, RotoWire blessed me by sending me to that event. Started out with 12 teams, and there were 2 divisions. Again, I was blessed to be in the Jim Brown division with 8, and I don't want to, because I'll miss one name. But I'm in a room with the best of the best. And I wondered, would I really belong with these people? But over the years, they made me feel very welcome and comfortable being there. So anyway, there were 2 divisions, but I was in that Jim Brown division. What a blessing to be in that. And it's grown. Now there are 14 team leagues, and there's 2 drafts at the Kings Classic. There's a snake draft and there's an auction draft. And so that was always fun to do both of them with the same group. Anyway, it's now grown into the fantasy football expo weekend as well. So now it's a big event in Canton, and our piece on Saturday where we draft, that's certainly one of the highlights of it. But there are parties, there's a expo where people see different booths and breakout sessions. It is just a massive, it's getting bigger every year. Apparently Bob Lung, who lives in Canton, said the Hall of Fame has plans on making the Hall of Fame much more of a destination for vacationers, where there could be hotels, there could even be an amusement park. And Bob, again, Bob Lung wants to continue having the Fantasy Football Expo there. And as this grows, this event could really become something where it's a mecca for fantasy football, second weekend of every August.
And again, you were the champ 2021, so got to give you some credit there.
Oh my gosh, it was huge. Winning it. And you know what? I'm proud of it because I won the Triple Crown that year. Points, record, and the championship. That is hard to do. Not just because I did it, but I know there have been leagues where I've won the points, I've won the record, and you're out in the first round. And I play Dave Richard in the championship game. Now, this is my funny thing about me, Arnie. I don't check fantasy scores until Tuesday. Because, look, I'm in multiple leagues. So if I need 30 points out of Joe Burrow, well, if I'm watching my scores and who my opponent has, my opponent might have Joe Burrow. I don't need that stress. So I check Tuesday morning to see if I won or lost. Well, Dave Richard calls me on Sunday early afternoon in the championship game. And I remembered, oh crap, he's got Jamar Chase. Chase had put a 55 or 55.6. Dave calls me. And what does he say? Oh, before he said, I go, Dave, it's game day. You can't call me on game day. I don't check my scores. He goes, congratulations, Jim. I go, what are you talking about? Jamar Chase just blew up. He goes, you killed me. And I look at, all right, now I got to look at the scores, right? And wow, I don't know how I did. I won by like 50 points or something like that. That was the team in the auction league. And I had built this team where I didn't spend for a lot of high-priced players because we have 3 flexes, 14 teams. There's like no waiver wire. So if you don't have depth, if you just build a starting lineup, but you don't have 3 flexes or a bench, you need an immense amount of luck. It was the year where it worked out perfectly, where I planned the team top, and enough players came through because, we have busts. I didn't have a lot of busts hit that year. That was my happiest thing, of winning the Triple Crown.
Yeah, that's, like I said, it's always such a bummer when you get the total points, or even if you get the total points and you have like a losing record. It's like, how do I not make the playoffs when I have the most points? I've heard other things before, like you can get wins for points and, win-loss record, but regardless of that, I mean, the listener of the show is listening to this dude, Jim Coventry, and they never heard him before, or they follow you. Either way, they want to learn more about you. Where do they go to learn more about Jim Coventry?
So, again, I just think that hub is going to be at Jim Coventry NFL. That's everything on Twitter. That's kind of where you find out anything you want, where I'm going to be, what I'm doing. I'm very good at posting up stuff that I have going on. If you want to come and actually talk to me, Canton, Ohio, the Fantasy Football Expo, if that's something you want to do, it's a great weekend for any fantasy player, any fantasy analyst. And if somebody does come out there and see me, come up to me. Don't be for a second like, oh man, he's not going to, I'm just a dude with a job. I'm nothing special. I work hard like everybody else. Don't be shy to come up and say hello, and I'm happy to talk to you.
So again, for a listener of the show, we've talked about the Fantasy Football Expo before. This is in the future, August 11th through the 13th, the weekend after the Pro Football Hall of Fame enshrinement at the same place. If you can make it a nice little week-long trip, that'd be perfect. You can get the greatest weekend, or what is it, the greatest weekend in pro football or something like that, and then the greatest weekend after that, fantasy football. Okay, Jim, we're going to do something real quick here on the DeLorean again. You're going to go forward 20 years into the future. Seems like you've seen like 30 some odd years of fantasy football. Let's predict in 20 years either what's going to happen or what you would like to see happen in the fantasy football landscape.
Wow, it's a great question, and I hate to say I'm going to be 78 years old, so I hope I'm around when the DeLorean
you just gotta
lands.
live. You gotta live long enough for AI to generate a bunch of kind of fancy technology for you for your cells.
Fabulous. I honestly wonder how much gambling is going to overtake fantasy. That player props, I am very, very concerned that fantasy football is going to change a lot, but it's going to be DFS. I think we found out that so many people don't win. Like 80, 90% lose, and it's a small number that win. And I think DFS is starting to maybe see its decline already. I think fantasy football is going to have always a strong following. But I think there's a world where gambling becomes so big that fantasy becomes back to just the hardcore people. And I think the ones that are kind of on the fringe, I think they're going to go to the gambling realm. So I think it's going to get smaller. And as an analyst, I shouldn't say that. I hope it doesn't. But I'm already morphing a lot of my work into the gambling realm as it is now. I mentioned earlier, I do, player projections, so player props. And so I'm already kind of morphing that way. So yeah, I think fantasy is it's going to diminish a bit. But I think the fantasy community will find a way to leverage into the gambling community, because a lot of people have trusted names in the fantasy environment. And I think a lot of these names are going to morph as well. So I think it's going to be a completely different community.
Yeah, maybe they'll find some kind of synergies between the two that can somehow transfer over. There'll be more trust in one realm where the other, like you said, there'll be more hardcore niche or something like that. But as we get out of here, we got to ask you last words of wisdom for the listener that's maybe in your shoes 15 years ago or whatever it is. That says, I might want to touch into this whole fantasy football thing, but I'm not sure where it's going to take me. What advice would you give to them?
So, yes. And you're talking about in terms of somebody wanting to work in the industry.
Work in the industry, whether it's, professional, full-time like you, or even just dibble-dabble.
Yes. My words of advice would be find an area within fantasy football that you can call your claim to fame, even if somebody else has it already. There are plenty of people that had their own little spin on things. Matt Harmon with his reception perception. It used to be JJ Zachariason with his late round quarterback. A lot of people had their little, area that they kind of made their own. And I still think anybody who wants to break in, find some way to separate yourself. And don't just be a generalist. Being a generalist is going to give you way too much competition. IDP, individual defensive players, that still is a field that always needs more attention. So if that's something somebody's heart's in, you definitely can go that way. And if there's some way that you look at the game that you feel is slightly different than others, find a way to leverage that. But the last thing, which is the most important, regardless, even if you are a generalist, and I know this line is overused. You hear so many people say, you'll never outwork me. Well, yeah, most people do outwork you. But if you legitimately make a commitment to working as hard as you possibly can, don't cut corners, work at your craft, work to be a better writer, work to be a better communicator, work on your football knowledge. Because the more work you put into you, the more likely you are going to end up where you want to be.
There you go. Just put the work in. If you're going to do something, you got to go all in. You got to enjoy it too. But you're going to have a greater chance of being where you want to be if you just put your nose to the grindstone and put that work in. And I want to personally thank Jim Coventry for taking time out of his busy schedule to share his fantasy football origin story with all of us. And if, again, you like the show, please drop us a rating and review in your podcast app of choice. Now, next week, we're going to get into some more old school information, but this time, we're going to learn about the backstory of the one and only Pod Vader. I don't know if I did that thing good enough. I don't know. I don't want to copyright, so I made it myself. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Fantasy Football Origin Stories. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please make sure to mash that little subscribe or follow button on your podcast player of choice, then head over to the website for the show notes and more Fantasy Football Origin Stories. That's at fantasyfootballoriginstories.com. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Darren Hayes, host of the Pigskin Dispatch and Jersey Dispatch podcast. I hope you've enjoyed another great episode here on Sports History Network. Now, speaking of sports history, this episode was brought to you by Firefly Books, and they have two great ones for you this summer. For basketball fans, they have the NBA 75, the definitive history by author Dave Zarum, who's appeared on our Jersey Dispatch podcast recently. He tells about the experience, the thrilling journey of the NBA, from its humble beginnings to its modern glory. Uncover the untold stories of triumph, controversy, and the greatest stars of the game. This isn't just a book. It's courtside seats to over 75 years of NBA history. And for the golf enthusiasts, swing into The Golf Round I'll Never Forget by Matt Adams. Relive 50 of golf's most memorable moments through the eyes of the legends themselves. From Garcia's triumph at the 2017 Masters to Nicklaus' miraculous 1986 comeback, it's the closest you'll get to walking the fairways with golf's greatest. Get your summer read on. Grab a copy of NBA 75 or The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, available online or at your favorite bookstore.